Hello, welcome to Miles to Go. I'm Miles O'Brien. We are living through an existential crisis for science and scientists. Just as it swings a wrecking ball through the East Wing of the White House, the Trump regime is systematically demolishing federally funded science wherever it sees it. This is science that saves lives, propels innovation, and answers some fundamental questions about our world. Science is under siege, a sad fact, and the title of an important new book by two world-class scientists who have endured the slings and arrows of this dystopian Luddite fever dream. Michael Mann is a climate scientist and a professor widely known for his hockey stick graph, a long history of stable global temperatures followed by a sharp upward blade of warming since the Industrial Revolution. That simple image became a powerful symbol and a lightning rod. It showed in one glance how humanity's emissions were reshaping the planet. For his work, Mann faced not only scientific debate, but fierce political blows, denialism, and personal smear campaigns. Peter Hotez is a pediatrician, vaccine scientist, and public health leader whose work has protected millions of lives in low-income countries and who became a prominent voice during the COVID-19 pandemic. He, too, has come under fire for defending evidence over ideology. He's been vilified online, targeted by conspiracy theories as he tried to prop up the truth amid a storm of disinformation. They are unfortunate bedfellows, but these scientists from different knotholes have found they have something sad and troubling in common. Their simple pursuit of knowledge for the greater good, to save lives, put them in harm's way. Together, they've unpacked and shed light on the sinister forces and cynical motivations at the root of this tsunami of stupidity. The book is Science Under Siege: How to Fight the Five Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. Let's dive in to some murky, choppy waters. Peter and Mike, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate your time. I don't know who wants to start this, but I'm curious how the two of you got together, how this book came to be. Kind of reminds me of that old Reese's peanut butter commercial. You got peanut butter in my chocolate, you got chocolate in my peanut butter. Did you kind of run into each other in the hall and said, hey, let's do a book, or how did it happen?
Yeah, I use that metaphor all too often, and the problem is the young scientists look at me like, what planet is this guy?
They don't know it. Yeah.
they don't know from Reese's peanut butter cups. So.
I have successfully carbon dated everybody because we all know this one. So right. tell me just the origin of writing a book like this. It's an important book, and you guys are busy guys.
Back in the late 1990s, when my co-authors and I published The Hockey Stick Curve, which sort of laid bare the reality of the climate crisis, I found myself under attack by, right-leaning news outlets, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, various organizations that deny climate change, many of which receive funding from the fossil fuel industry. And so I found myself at the center of these attacks aimed at discrediting my science and at discrediting me personally as a way of discrediting my science. So as I like to say, it was sort of PTSD for me when, 5 years ago, I saw Peter and Tony Fauci and other public health scientists being subject to precisely the same sorts of attacks against them, using the same tactics, many of them coming from the same places. I reached out to Peter, or he reached out to me. We can't remember which was which, but we became friends. I felt like I had something to offer based on my experiences. And over time, we realized that we had a book to write. Now, that's more than a year ago. So we had no idea of the sort of the resonance that the book would have in this environment that we now find ourselves in, where anti-science has reached levels that we never even imagined possible here in the United States, but that's where we are.
I think it was also, we really started talking more when there was this big pile on in the summer of 2023 I remember it was around Father's Day when I got taunted into debating Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Joe Rogan podcast, and then Elon Musk weighed in, and it became this like whole sensation on Twitter or X, whatever you call it, and this massive pressure on me to publicly debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the Joe Rogan show, which I didn't want to do because I think it was really a prop. I was being used as a prop to make him look like a serious presidential candidate, and I didn't want to help him do that. And I also thought it would send the wrong message about how we do science. We don't do science with people who espouse crackpot ideas. And I think Mike reached out to me because basically it was like, hey, been there, done that. And, and I sought his advice and counsel about how to manage this whole crazy thing that blew, because I got stalked at my home for not debating him, and all this other kind of paranormal events started to happen. And he helped me put it into context.
We have long familiarity with what has happened with climate denialism and climate. I have to say, as I watched the pandemic unfold, Peter, I thought, well, this is an opportunity for science to redeem itself and talk about snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Did you see it coming at all?
Well, early on in the pandemic, I think it did in this. I don't know about redeeming, but because I think science was always held high, but at least in the minds and eyes of the American people. But I think, I thought perhaps this could help spell the death knell of a growing anti-vaccine movement, because people would see the consequences of a pandemic and be seeking a vaccine. And indeed, in the beginning of the pandemic, even Fox News was having me on a regular basis. I was going on Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, and in what universe would that have ever happened before? And it was great. So I thought, it wasn't great. It was a horrible national tragedy, but at least it was an opportunity. And then, the very dark forces coming from a different part of the political spectrum decided that they were going to double down and try to blame the scientist and propose these outlandish therapies like hydroxychloroquine, and which did absolutely nothing. And it turns out in retrospect it was done to keep the country going so oil and gas prices wouldn't fall. And that's when Mike and I made our first comparison, that there was overlap between the attacks on biomedical science and climate science. And I refused to play. I refused to go along with it. So by refusing to promote the White House, at that time the West Wing of the White House was saying, use hydroxychloroquine, and they were, proposing that the pandemic was being started deliberately by the Chinese Communist Party and sending infected Chinese on airplanes to ignite the pandemic that was coming out of the West Wing of the White House. I said, this is all nonsense, and we better get serious because it's going to be a very significant pandemic. But that's when you saw the attacks really begin to accelerate. So just as you thought, science would, at least science, people supporting science would triumph, and ultimately I think it did at some level, but there became this whole segment of the country that was determined to squash science.
Mike, having lived through the climate battles, you talk about the transition, what began as denial moved into deflection and so forth. And all of this got compressed into a very short timeline with the pandemic. And you could take all of this really back. Naomi Oreskes in her book, Merchants of Doubt, talked about the tobacco playbook. This just happens time and again. It just seems like it speeds up maybe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've seen the gun lobby use some of the same tactics, deflection, blaming it on, in the case of, tobacco, right, denying that there is a health threat while their own internal research showed that there was, in fact, a threat. And that playbook has certainly been borrowed by the fossil fuel industry. ExxonMobil's own internal documents from the early 1980s show that their own scientists warned of catastrophic consequences if we continued to burn fossil fuels and warm the planet, just like the tobacco industry hid their own internal research that demonstrated the threat of their product. The fossil fuel industry did the same thing. And as Peter said, similar sort of tactics were used in the assault on the public health messaging by him and his colleagues, the anti-vax movement. And in the end, the commonality is that it serves some ideological interest. In the case of fossil fuels, it's obvious why the Koch brothers, who are these funders of libertarian think tanks and front groups that assail climate science, that attack renewable energy, it's understandable. Koch Industries is the largest privately held fossil fuel interest in the world. Why is it that Koch Industries, the Koch brothers, would want to attack the messaging of the public health community? As Peter said, early on, it was hurting their fossil fuel profits. These lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, the economic slowdown was decreasing fossil fuel usage, and so they decided they had to attack the public health messaging by people like Peter and Tony Fauci, and they sort of created this weaponized movement that ultimately would reject all of the recommendations, all of the messaging from the public health community, which meant vaccines as well. And there's a certain irony in that Donald Trump's possibly his greatest contribution in his first term was Operation Warp Speed, was the development of that vaccine. And in the end, he couldn't even embrace it because his base had been weaponized against vaccination.
Yeah, I mean, what happened was in that they in that zeal to push back against vaccine mandates, when after vaccines became available, which I kind of understood. I didn't agree with it, but I understood the rationale, the libertarian philosophy, but what they did was they then went the next measure. And they brought in all these very toxic anti-vaccine activists to falsely discredit the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. So when vaccines rolled out, by the time of the Delta wave in the last half of 2021 and early 2022, you started to see mass death among people refusing to vaccinate because they were watching Fox News every night or Rogan podcasts and hearing about ivermectin, which does absolutely nothing, or hearing all the toxic anti-vaccine activists on Rogan podcast or Fox News. And this was documented by two groups, Media Matters for America and a research group out of the Federal University of Science and Technology in Switzerland, that they did that. So what started out is annoying rhetoric, like at the CPAC conference in Dallas in 2021, Matthew Cawthorn, the representative of North Carolina, said something to the effect, well, first they're going to vaccinate you and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles and this kind of stuff. And you roll your eyes, but, I understood it, and it was, I didn't like it, but, I don't think it did that much damage. It was then that the CPAC conference in Dallas brought on all the anti-vaccine activists to discredit the effectiveness and safety. Then they were brought on Fox News. Then they were brought on Rogan podcast. So if you were watching all this stuff, and that's all you're watching, you kind of went down that rabbit hole, and you made an executive decision based on what you were hearing not to take a COVID vaccine. And because they were being targeted, these individuals. And as I said, 200,000 Americans needlessly died because they refused COVID vaccines, including 40 to 50,000 in my state of Texas. And that's where it spilled into my lane, where I had to say something, because now anti-science activism had become a killing force in America.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that quickly, because this messaging that sort of plays at the heartstrings of sort of their base, that this is about taking away your freedom. Your freedom in the case of vaccines and stay-at-home orders, all these public health measures are taking away your freedom. It's the same messaging that they used to convince their base that climate action is just a way to take away your freedom. You can't fly to see grandma for the holidays. You can't eat your hamburgers anymore. And so they often play on that. They play on this idea that it's big government trying to take away your rights to weaponize their base against these actions, whether it be vaccination or, in the case of climate change, the move away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy.
Well, you know what they say, always follow the money. And but you say, weaponization in this case has, a couple of meanings. And you both, gentlemen, have been targets of at least threats of violence. And to me, it's one thing. The scenario you lay out is bad enough, but when it turns to personal threats, that changes things quite dramatically, in my view. First of all, just detail a little bit the kinds of things you've been through. Peter, you go first, and then you go, Mike.
I think you'll see some similarities. I mean, a lot of it is online, on social media, especially what used to be Twitter. Now it's called X. I mean, that's Elon Musk opened it wide for death threats and doesn't do anything to really stop it, or public calls for my execution, and a lot of Nazi imagery as well. That this is going to happen in Nuremberg after a military-style tribunal. They love their Nazi metaphors, and I started getting swastikas sent to my home because I'm the trifecta for them, because I'm a scientist, a vaccine scientist, and a Jewish vaccine scientist. And
the fact that we're both have Jewish ancestry makes us sort of
so there was that.
So there's an anti-Semitic component to this, which is particularly ugly.
Yeah, there is, and it's not complete overlap, but I actually wrote a couple of articles about it on the comparison, anti-science, anti-Semitism. We touch on it in the book, and there's a history to that. So, for instance, in Weimar Germany, Einstein's theory of relativity was called the Jewish fraud by the leadership, and same with Freud, and of course blaming then there was the blaming the Jews for starting the virus. So they had me in a secret lab with George Soros in a basement in Davos someplace at the World Economic Forum making the virus. And the crazier the conspiracy, the more people believed it. But there were some pretty tangible threats, and I was stalked at lectures and where I was speaking, and had to have security, and came to my home, and so there is that whole dark element to it. But I thought it was important to explain why vaccines were safe and effective, and I was well positioned to do it because I'm a pediatrician, vaccine scientist. We developed low-cost vaccines. Our COVID vaccine reached 100 million people in India and Indonesia, proving we could bypass the big pharma companies. But I also have a daughter with autism and intellectual disabilities. And years ago, I was asked by the NIH to talk to Bobby Kennedy. And from those discussions, I wrote a book about it called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. And that had already labeled me a public enemy even before the COVID pandemic. And this really accelerated it.
Mike, how about you? Have you felt in fear for your family or yourself personally?
Yeah, like I said before, everything that played out with Peter and his colleagues, Tony Fauci, was so similar to things that had played out literally decades earlier when we published the hockey stick curve in the late 1990s. And I was attacked by right-wing media organizations, by front groups, and AstroTurf organizations, as we call them, funded by either conservative sort of plutocrats or fossil fuel interests. And there were death threats against me, demands I'd be fired from my job. There were threats against my family as well. You name it. At one point or another, I had to face all of these sorts of threats and intimidation efforts, demands for investigations by powerful congressmen, an attorney general from Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli, who wanted to force me to turn over all of my internal documents so he could find something to embarrass or humiliate or discredit me with, all because the hockey stick was this graph that told a simple story. You didn't need to understand the complex workings of Earth's climate system to understand what this graph was telling us, that there is this unprecedented warming taking place, and it's probably due to human activity. That made me a real threat to some of these powerful interests, as I said before. And in the end, I, like Peter, felt the stakes were too great to just give in to that. I mean, it would be easy to say, all right, that's it. I'm just going to shun the limelight. I'm going to retreat to my laboratory and do what I love doing anyways. The reason I went into science wasn't because I wanted to be in the center of some, the most contentious political debate in human history. It was because I loved doing science. I loved crunching numbers. I loved finding patterns in data, running models, comparing them with observations. But I felt that the stakes were too great for that. I'm sort of naturally, my constitution, I suppose, is that of a fighter, and so I felt I needed to fight back against these attacks. But more than that, I realized that these attacks were far more pernicious, because what they were really aimed at doing was sending a message, as Peter has alluded to younger scientists who might think about getting involved and speaking out. It was to really silence the entire community by making an example of me. And I realized that there was a responsibility upon me to make sure that they weren't successful in doing that and fighting back.
Well, we thank you both for not cowing to that, because this is important to speak out on. And I've been just experiencing anecdotally as I try to tell the story of what's unfolding right now, this anti-science wave that I'm trying to tell the story of. Many scientists are afraid to come forward for good reason. And so just before we go any further, I want to make sure you know that you both are appreciated for going out on a limb here and saying this, because it comes with risk. All right, so
and I'll just say also, one of the things that both Mike and I experienced, our institutions are better than most, but at a lot of the research universities, academic health centers, especially, they don't like their docs and scientists speaking out because they don't want any attention. They want to control the brand and so that's the other piece to this. It's not, as Martin Luther King said, not that I'm comparing us to Martin Luther King, but, he once said, it's not just the words of the enemies, it's the silence of the friends. And you have to know that you have the backing of your institution, or what you'll kind of get is often is from young scientists, hey, you're an academic, you have academic freedom, ... but don't screw this up and don't get the institution in trouble. And of course, if you're out there in the public domain enough, you will screw it up and you will get the institution in trouble, and you need to know that you have their backing. So we need that culture shift as well, and we discuss that in the book.
Yeah, there's a level of risk aversion among our institutions that sort of is restrictive and sometimes prevents scientists from being willing to speak out because, out of fear of retribution, that they'll be attacked, their institution will find itself under pressure to fire. We've seen a lot of that recently, in fact.
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen that underscored most recently as the Trump administration seeks to defund universities, and their response has sometimes not always been courageous, let's say. Let's talk. I like how you broke down the forces at play here into 5 Ps, and it's always fun to have alliteration so you can remember things, if nothing else. But
I'm a sucker for alliteration. I guess that comes through here.
Yeah, Mike gets all the credit for coming up with the 5 Ps. The 5 Ps and any Tolkien reference, that's all on Mike.
I'm going to run through them real quick. It's the plutocrats, the petrostates, the pros, the propagandists, and the press. And you deconstruct what's going on in each of these sectors of our society. It's simple to say we'll just follow the money. It's greed and it's the fossil fuel interest. But there's an ecosystem here that makes this all work or not work, depending on your perspective. First of all, let's talk about the plutocrats. What specifically do you think drives this group, the plutocrats, we'll start with you, Peter, on a strong anti-science agenda?
Certainly, with the oil and gas and the fossil fuels, it's a more straightforward shot, right? I mean, it's purely financial, right? Especially if you've got your equity tied up in any way with the oil and gas industry, and that helps explain the petrostates like Saudi and Russia, and helps explain, some of the plutocrats like the Kochs and maybe even to some extent the Murdoch media enterprise. It took a little more explanation to explain about the vaccines and that sort of thing, and the biomedical science. And in some cases, it is financial. So you've got now the rapid ascendancy of the health, wellness, and influencer industry. And have you ever wondered why there are always anti-parasitic drugs like ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or fenbendazole that they're pushing? It's because you can buy that stuff up in bulk, very low cost, then you repackage it, jack up the price, and you can charge it with a $1,600 telehealth visit. And now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So in order to peddle that snake oil, you've also got to discredit the mainstream science and portray people like myself or Michael as kind of cartoon villains or public enemies. That's how the business model works. It's very dark, very cynical, but that is the reality. And unfortunately, now you're seeing this with Mr. Kennedy. If you listen to his public rhetoric, when I talked to him years ago, which is how I got involved in combating the anti-vaccine activism, he didn't really talk about supplements and things like that. Now, in our with the measles epidemic that hit all, for the first 8 months of this year, that began in West Texas, he would come out and say, well, you can get the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or you can get this cocktail of supplements like vitamin A and budesonide and clarithromycin, and you're kind of scratching your head and say, where the heck does that come from? And the answer is it's the wellness and influencer industry. So there is that big financial motivation. But I think for the other pieces, around this libertarian concept, health freedom, medical freedom, it's a form of political control, even if it means the deaths of your constituents in large numbers.
And undermining faith in sort of expertise, in scientific expertise. That's a common theme here as well, because in a world where nobody knows who they can trust, well, they're much more vulnerable to the misinformation and disinformation that's promoted by some of these bad actors.
I think what surprised a lot of people was the seeming dramatic shift in the world of the tech bros, Silicon Valley. Now, Mike, Elon Musk makes, electric vehicles. You would think he would come down a little differently when it came to science and climate in particular. But there is this very strong libertarian streak there that I think perhaps we've overlooked, and concerns about any sort of regulation really get them revved up. Is that part of what we're seeing here?
Yeah, it is. And we talk a little bit about sort of the historical context there in the book. You've got figures like Peter Thiel, who was a libertarian activist, but also a major sort of funder of technology companies, and was involved early on with Facebook, with Twitter, with a lot of these social media companies. And I think that he has been sort of one of the leading voices in the sort of tech bro community that has tried to sort of merge sort of technocentrism and techno-optimism with libertarian politics. And he's been very successful. And we have seen this sort of change in the ethos, change in the culture in Silicon Valley, which was, as you allude to, I mean, you would think technology, computer science, this is science, this is technology, it's driven by facts, it's driven by logic and data and all of these things that we like to think are sort of part of the rich tapestry that supports science. And we would like to think that technologists would be natural allies when it comes to the promotion and defense of basic science. But it's really about the ideology. It's about the fact that there was this sort of libertarian ethos that crept into the world, the sort of high-tech community. And you see this, like, there's no other way to describe it, a Bond villain-like arc. Elon Musk's arc is that of a Bond villain. He was a hero of the renewable energy movement. Tesla, electric vehicles, Solar City, making solar panels, solar technology available to the world. He was this hero of the environmental movement, and then along the way, something happened. He became sort of activated against what he perceived as wokeness. And as we like to say, when it comes to sort of being part of that ideological tribe, if you will, the sort of MAGA world, you're not allowed to pick and choose. You have to sort of go with the full menu. So if
you have to buy the whole farm. Or I think Mike once said, you can't go a la carte. You got to get the prefix menu. And so what happens is you either buy none of it or all of it. So it's Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, right? And it's it says that COVID vaccines killed more Americans than COVID, which is absolute nonsense, or that the virus was made in a laboratory or leaked, and climate science and the climate crisis is a hoax and the COVID is a hoax. And you you see this with these public intellectuals, I'll put that in quotation marks, that once they go down that rabbit hole, start down the rabbit hole of railing against one aspect, in time they take it all on, and it becomes part of the belonging to this thing. And you struggle because you say, look, you're entitled to your libertarian philosophies, and I don't really care about your tech companies, and I hope you're very successful, but don't adopt this stuff because it's going to kill Americans.
Well, let's look at Musk and his takeover of Twitter, right? Because it was actually leveraged by Russia and Saudi Arabia, two of the principal petrostates that had an interest in weaponizing.
And by the way, you have nicely segued to the next piece.
Okay,
thank you very much. Petrostates. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So Twitter became weaponized to promote the sort of climate denialism, anti-vax sentiment, an assault on renewable energy. It became weaponized to promote the agenda of those who helped Musk with this takeover. And there is a fair amount of cooperation. We see some close ties between Musk and Russia and Saudi Arabia and the Trump administration. And so there is this coalition right now that has a common political agenda, and they've taken control to some extent of the public sphere. They're buying out all of our traditional media outlets. PBS still stands tall in terms of its independence, but they're trying to defund that. And
they've done a pretty good job.
Yeah, well, they are, unfortunately. That was part of Project 2025. That's part of the takedown of the
which Trump knew nothing about, of course, right?
right.
What was interesting about the petrostates, I think one of the very few disagreements Mike and I had about the book was Saudi Arabia, because that was a rare instance where they were really attacking the climate science and the climate scientists, but they were pretty good about the biomedical science component. So that one didn't seem to affect them so much. So
well, that's a good example, Peter, of where there is a clear interest on one side of on the climate side, and not so obvious an interest on the public health side. So that makes sense. But they've done so much damage. In particular, the way, as I was saying, that our public sphere has now been weaponized. Social media companies that are now all owned by plutocrats who have literally, in some cases, like Elon Musk, changed the algorithm to amplify the anti-science and to silence the voices of the actual experts.
What is it, do you think, about authoritarian regimes that almost always, historically, are anti-science? Why is that?
There's a strong correlation between authoritarian states and extractive states. So countries that have extractive economies, that primarily their economy is driven by the extraction of natural resources, that the nature of that sort of economic system is such that it leads to income disparity. It leads to authoritarian structures. And so there is this historical relationship, again, between sort of extractive countries and authoritarian countries. And obviously, when it comes to climate, well, it's all about the extraction of fossil fuels. These petrostates are obviously a special case of extractive economies. They're extracting fossil fuels to drive their economy.
You could make the argument that the United States is a petrostate, and we've been able to sort of disguise that fact by our everything we hold dear, our democracy, and our commitment to science and understanding and sort of an enlightenment approach to life. But now, as we reduce that, we become just another petrostate in a way?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's always been there. It's, from the Texas economy, Pennsylvania, the state I live in, is where oil was discovered in this country and was built on coal, and and so many people were supported by the coal industry for years. Now natural gas is a big part of the economy. So, it's understandable. Fossil fuel extraction has always been part of our economy, but we had sort of basic democratic institutions that sort of held that in check. We had an Environmental Protection Agency, which, by the way, was created by Richard Nixon. And so it wasn't always so partisan, the idea that we need basic checks. We need to provide the conditions that allow industry to flourish, but we've also got to protect the interests of our people. And that means protecting people against pollution and the damage caused by climate change. There used to be some level of bipartisan consensus on that point. But what we've seen over the last decade and a half is really one of the two parties, the Republican Party, becomes so beholden to fossil fuel interests that it's sort of broken that sort of restoring force that always allowed us to come to some sort of balance when it came to economic and energy and environmental policy.
Yeah, and it's the same thing, when I moved to Texas 15 years ago, I called them, George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker Republicans, and even if you didn't agree with all of their points, you never doubted for a minute they cared about the country and they cared about science and medicine, and they were all in. And it's this new stuff that's just so perplexing and so self-defeating and so self-destructive.
Yeah, it was profound for me. I'll just add, the first event that Peter and I did for the book was actually at the Baker Institute at Rice University down in Houston. And we spoke about this early on, how, there are these sort of old school Republicans like James Baker, George H.W. Bush's EPA administrator, William K. Riley, who actually developed the concept of cap and trade to deal with the acid rain problem. For so many years, there was good faith. You could agree to disagree about the solutions and the policies, but we could all accept the basic facts. And there was some level of factual consensus when it came to these emerging global environmental threats. But again, at some point along the way, we saw sort of that become hijacked by fossil fuel interests who realized that if they could gain control of one of the two major parties, they could implement their agenda going forward. And that's sort of where we are.
Exactly. So let's move to the next P, the pros. These are scientists that seem to have credentials, who should know better, who inject disinformation into the whole ecosystem. Peter, tell me a little bit, what sorts of experiences have you encountered with individuals like this, and how dangerous is it?
Yeah, there are two types of pros in this space. One were those, they're physicians, many board-certified physicians who just, went full on into the wellness and influencer industry and began selling supplements and things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and then jacking up the price and selling it with very expensive telehealth visits. And as bad as that was, because they didn't do anything for COVID, and people were using it instead of COVID vaccines, and causing people to lose their lives and get very sick, they went out of their way to target people like myself and launch this whole online smear campaign against myself and some of my colleagues. And then there was another type, and those were the Fox News talking heads who, unfortunately, some of them have very high-level positions now in the Trump administration. And there they would also go after me. And the point there was they weren't experts on infectious diseases or vaccines. They were in other fields such as health economics or surgery and that kind of thing. But, the Chiron at the bottom would have the names of very famous medical schools. And so the viewer would think, hey, here's this guy from Stanford Medical School or Johns Hopkins Medical School. They must know what they're talking about. Well, they didn't, or they knew, but they were misleading people. And that caused a lot of damage. And not only that, they would also corrupt how science was done. I mean, they would, one would say something to the effect, well, of course, Hotez is in the secret cabal with Dr. Fauci because he has funding from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases of the National Institutes of Health. Well, heck, his whole Department of Microbiology at his medical school is funded by NIAID. So it was so disingenuous and so dangerous, because it made people think that, that NIH grants go to line scientists' pockets and that sort of stuff, or they'd say I'm a shill for the pharma companies, even though in fact it's the opposite. We made a low-cost vaccine showing you could actually bypass the pharma companies, but that wasn't convenient for their narrative, and so it created this very dark world very quickly.
Yeah, as I like to say, when Fox News lies, people die, and that was true with the COVID-19 crisis.
So propagandists, and it seems like pros and propagandists, there's some overlap. And frankly, when you look at Fox News, it overlaps with the press as well. But what is your distinction there? Propagandists are just good talking heads who can articulate these opinions. Is that the idea?
Yeah, more or less. The pros are making money doing this, and the propagandists are happy to do it, whether or not they're profiting from it. And more often, the propagandists are sort of a little lower on the totem pole. They're sort of the ground forces. They're out there on social media promoting, these anti-science talking points. They're helping spread misinformation and disinformation. Whereas the pros are getting paid. They're sort of orchestrating this. They're getting paid for it. And as Peter said, that can either be these sort of health, the people in sort of the health freedom world who are marketing these false cures and making money off of doing so. In the climate space, it can mean fossil fuel apologists who are hired to appear on news programs, to write op-eds, to be out there promoting fossil fuel industry friendly talking points in the media. And so ultimately, there's a lot of overlap. Basically, the pros, they're a little higher on the totem pole. They're getting paid to do this. They better understand what they're doing. The propagandists are just very effective at spreading the misinformation and disinformation. And some of them are doing it, not for the money, but just because they're true believers. And in the end, it just floods our public discourse with misinformation and disinformation.
So then we move to the press, and you talk quite a bit about Fox, and I would suggest that you could put them in the propagandist category as well. Peter, how corrosive is the Fox effect in all of this? It's almost hard to overstate, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this was documented by two groups, Media Matters for America and a research group out of Switzerland documented the role of Fox News. And every night, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity filled their nighttime broadcast, the most widely watched opinion news broadcast in America, 3 million viewers a night or more, with anti-vaccine content. And, and again, it was like at the CPAC conference, it's one thing to rail against vaccine mandates. It's another to provide false information about the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, and that's where it became so deadly toxic. And not just on Fox News, but also the Wall Street Journal in their opinion section, which is controlled by News Corp. The journalists themselves, the reporters, were pretty good, but they basically turned the Wall Street Journal opinion section into the print version of Fox News in terms of attacking science, and that was terrible. But then as Mike and I point out, that's just the first part. The other was all of the false equivalency that even the legacy media, the mainstream media, did, like the New York Times and Washington Post, especially around COVID origins, and they just promoted a lot of conspiracy, gave equal weight to conspiracies as they did the mainstream science. And in some ways that could have even been more damaging because, the people are watching Fox News, you already had a certain amount of acceptance that they were down that rabbit hole and they were going to be problematic. But, I had colleagues and smart, educated people starting to believe that COVID was leaked from a lab or that it was made through gain of function research. And it wasn't. I mean, we have half a dozen papers in the best scientific journals clearly showing zoonotic spillover, just like the original coronavirus, SARS, did in 2002. And all of the intelligence agencies agree that it's not due to gain of function. And yet and very unlikely that it's due to lab leaks, zoonotic origins. Yet you have most of the American people now thinking otherwise, and I blame some of the legacy media for that kind of false equivalency.
Yeah, we call this performative neutrality, and there's way too much of it in the legacy media, New York Times, Washington Post, that'll elevate sort of the pseudoscience of the lab leak theory as if it's on an equal footing with the consensus of the world's health and medical scientific community, zoonotic spillover. One other thing that I would point out here, one of the overlaps here is the fact that disinformation is deadly. And clearly that's true when it comes to COVID-19 vaccinations, but it's also true with regard to the climate crisis. Millions of deaths every year, premature deaths that are associated with exposure to fossil fuel pollution, and the consequences, the deadly impacts now of extreme heat waves and wildfires and floods and superstorms. And so whether you're talking about COVID-19 and pandemics, or you're talking about the climate crisis, the disinformation is deadly. It's leading to a massive loss of life, and it will get that much worse if we continue going down this road.
Well, you talk about something that is near and dear to my experience. In December of 2008, I was part of an 8-person science unit at CNN. We all got summarily fired. And because what do we know about the Kardashians? And out the door we went.
It was a sad day.
It was a sad day,
and
but that's just part of a trend. Science journalism has been a canary in the coal mine for journalism writ large. There's very little of it left. I'm the last network science correspondent on network television in the United States, so there is a lack of expertise inside these large organizations. The New York Times still has science-dedicated people, but I don't see their impact enough, frankly, in their coverage. And when you see a pandemic covered from the White House press room, you know you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we have here. Yeah. And journalism is in such a sorry state. I don't have any easy remedies for this, but it must cause you great dismay, because you guys are constantly talking to reporters who really don't have the time to develop any expertise at all in your respective fields.
That's right.
And this is when things go really awry in the media, in my view.
Yeah, and we get into that. I mean, that's one of the problems. We talk about this this transition in the way that the media now deals with matters, environmental science in general, stories that once would be covered by science journalists who had training in science and could litigate the sometimes contentious debates within the scientific community. Now they're going to be covered by like a political reporter who will sort of default to so-called false balance. They can't litigate the science. They don't know who's right, so they'll just present both sides as if each should get equal weight. And that's part of why we have this problem of performative neutrality now in the mainstream press and the legacy press. But that is a big part of the problem. And we talk about it in the book. I mean, the solution obviously is to sort of get back to our roots, to recognize, for journalism programs, for media organizations, to recognize just how important it is to have objective, fact-based evidence when it comes to talking about policy-relevant science, because the results of getting away from that, to repeat myself, are now deadly. It can be measured in lost lives because we've gotten away from that.
All right, so let's talk about scientists themselves. There was a time when scientists were harshly critical of Carl Sagan because he would dare to go on the Tonight Show and talk about science. They call it the Carl Sagan effect, and to some extent that might still exist. But what, Peter, would you say to your fellow scientists about their responsibility these days to try to find ways to communicate with a broad audience? I think so much of this is people don't even know what a scientist looks like.
Yeah, and there's
except maybe
actually
for the person that does the weather forecast or something. But that's it,
well,
right?
we actually quote a study, Research America, which is the policy group based in the D.C. area. They do these studies every few years, and where they ask the American people, can you name a living scientist? And the numbers are always the same. They keep doing the survey, the numbers are always the same. 75% of Americans cannot name a living scientist. And when
the 25% who can name our good friend Bill Nye, the science guy,
or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and there's nothing, and we love them both.
We love them.
But they're not working scientists in the sense of they're writing, scientific papers and doing major revisions of papers and going through the grant process and presenting their findings at scientific meetings. So basically, it says we're invisible, and by being invisible, it allows the bad actors to portray us as they wish, which are, of course, shadowy figures lurking around in white coats, plotting all sorts of nefarious things. And how do we turn that around? How do we, get more working scientists out there? I think there are, especially, not everybody wants to do it, and they shouldn't be forced to. We know a lot of good colleagues that want to just keep focused on the papers and the grants and the experiments, and they're great scientists, and they obviously make important contributions, as they always had for hundreds of years. But for those who do want to be out in the public domain, it's not easy for a number of reasons. One, there are no metrics for promotion around doing things like talking to Miles O'Brien, right? It's not recognized as important.
There should be an automatic raise.
Right, yeah, right.
Right,
but it's not
100%.
It's not recognized by the deans and the university presidents as being a substantive activity, and we need to build in metrics for that, or writing an opinion piece, or even writing a single author book if you're a scientist is not even considered very impactful compared to getting a paper in what's called a high impact journal. And so that's got to shift. Or what you'll get at best often is, hey, okay, you're an academic, you're free to speak out. We'll let you do that, but don't screw this up and get the institution in trouble, because they're fiercely protective of the brand of the institution. So you would feel like you're doing it with the sort of Damocles over your head. And so most scientists just say, well, I guess I'll move on and do something else, and not care so much about public engagement.
Yeah.
And we've got to fix that. We also have to work on the K through 12 process and build that up, build up critical thinking skills, and not just talk about the science itself and teach the second law of thermodynamics, as I say, but the processes of science. What does it mean to get a grant, and why, if you get a federal grant, it doesn't line your pockets. It goes to support the institution and the laboratories, because the bad actors weaponize what grants do. And so all of that has to be reinvented.
Yeah, to reiterate what Peter said, you don't have adequate positive incentives for scientists who have an interest and a proclivity. Not every scientist should be out there. We know we have colleagues who certainly shouldn't be out there speaking to the public. It doesn't play to their skill set. It doesn't play to their talents and their proclivities. But to those who do have sort of a natural talent for that and affinity, we need to provide resources. It needs to be rewarded. And there's been some effort in the world of science and academia. Public outreach is now something that you do report on your annual report. And so there's supposed to be some weight placed on public outreach, and that can mean writing op-eds and giving public lectures, et cetera. But there's not enough weight on that. There isn't enough positive incentive. And there's a huge, as Peter says, negative incentive, that there are a lot of people who don't want the scientists out there, and they're more than willing to put their thumbs on the scale to make it difficult and indeed to make it dangerous for a would-be scientist or academic to be out there speaking to the public about something that's contentious and something that challenges the interests of some of these bad actors and powerful special interests. So there are a lot of things that we can do to try to create positive incentives. To deal with those negative incentives, we need institutions to display courage, right? Why do these institutions exist? They exist to develop and disseminate knowledge to the public and policymakers. And if we get away from that mission, if we allow ourselves to be cowed by those who don't want that production and dissemination of knowledge, who don't want individuals who are in a position to speak truth to power, then why do those institutions even exist? We're getting away from the core mission of academic and scientific institutions.
So you talk about tipping points in your book, and Mike, you study tipping points when it comes to the climate, but there are tipping points of public opinion.
Yeah.
There's such inertia in the other direction right now for the disinformation, the anti-science, the outright lies. What's it going to take to reach a tipping point where people wake up and perhaps view these things differently, think about science more analytically, consider ideas outside their little bubble?
We're all wondering, what will it take? These devastating wildfires that are plaguing the West Coast, the unprecedented flooding that we saw in the southeastern U.S. last year with Hurricane Helene,
or my state of Texas and the
flooding,
River.
the unprecedented flooding, and the deaths. In this case, of school-age children who died from the floods. What will it take? We thought we had that moment when Katrina sort of essentially destroyed New Orleans. It felt like this was a turning point, like maybe this was an opportunity to recognize that we are facing an existential threat. Superstorm Sandy, another one of those seeming opportunities, I sometimes call the Cuyahoga River moment. When the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in the late 1970s, it sort of spurred the environmental movement because people realized, hey, if our rivers are catching on fire, there's something wrong. We need to do something about it. And there's this feeling like we've had so many of those moments.
And there's no autocorrection. I mean, look at this measles epidemic where we had 100 hospitalizations. 2 kids died because their parents didn't vaccinate them, and you had Mr. Kennedy sitting with one of the parents and saying, "Boy, sure glad we didn't vaccinate him." I mean, it was
not enough people taking.
It was positively surreal.
Yeah,
Peter.
yeah.
That was
or
surreal.
The fact
not enough people out there taking him to task. That's part of we get back to the role of the press and the media. We need the media and press.
That should have been grounds right there for termination. Or the fact that you had 200,000 Americans die because they refused a COVID vaccine. When you go into the rural conservative areas of Texas, like West Texas or East Texas, you pretty much everyone you talk to has lost a loved one because they or someone they know or a friend or a colleague because they refused a COVID vaccine. Where's the autocorrection? Where's the feedback?
Yeah, and I think
that really concerns me.
I mean, Miles, and getting back to that question, as Peter's saying here, it used to be that these sorts of events, these tragedies, would trigger policy innovation, would trigger change. And part of that is that we had good faith in our public discourse. We had trusted messengers in the media. Well, all that is under assault right now. And in the absence of that infrastructure, in the absence of trust on the part of the public for institutions, for expertise, it is very difficult for us to sort of internalize these events and I don't want to say take advantage, but recognize what they're telling us. They're telling us that we need to do something, that we need to institute policies to deal with these increasing threats that we face from pandemics, from the climate crisis, what have you. We've lost so much of the infrastructure that allowed us decades ago to respond to these sorts of crises. And that's what I fear. And as I've said before, I think this is true with COVID. I think it's true with pandemics and public health, and it's certainly true with climate. There's really no path to addressing these problems that doesn't go through a functioning American democracy. And so it all then comes back to the health of our democracy and our ability to make sure that policies are informed by facts. And that all comes down to us, right? If enough people turn out in elections and vote for politicians who are willing to act on our behalf and are willing to recognize what the science says over the demagogues and the hired hands of the fossil fuel industry and other bad actors, if enough people turn out and vote for politicians who will represent our interests, we can turn this around. We've got a midterm election a year from now, where there's going to be an opportunity to try to right this ship before it's too late.
Mike Mann, Peter Hotez. The book is Science Under Siege. I highly recommend it to anybody watching or listening. It's a sobering account of where we are, but it's important to understand all the nuance, and they've captured all that. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you, Miles. Always a delight.
Yeah, good conversation.
What Michael Mann and Peter Hotez have written is a compelling call to action, which names names and implicates the guilty parties. As you read it, and I hope you do, think about what you can do to answer their call. It's disheartening because the wrecking ball is already swinging. When the dust settles, we will have a lot of work to do to try to rebuild the scientific enterprise which made this country great. I guess we'll have to make our country great again. So call your elected representatives, let them know you're outraged, find and support the right candidates, and vote as if the future of this country depends on it. Because it surely does. I'm Miles O'Brien. Thanks for watching and listening. Please like and subscribe if you feel inclined.